The charity gala erupted into chaos the instant Margaret Doyle, a plus-size catering assistant, reached across Nathaniel Kane's table and silently replaced the champagne flute resting beside his hand. Every bodyguard moved at once. Several wealthy guests gasped, convinced they had just witnessed the most reckless mistake of the evening. Nathaniel Kane, the city's most feared cartel financier, lifted his eyes toward the young woman, his cold stare freezing the entire ballroom. Yet Margaret neither apologized nor tried to explain. She simply placed the new glass before him, turned away, and disappeared into the crowd as though nothing had happened. 15 minutes later, a routine security sweep uncovered a lethal compound hidden inside the original flute. The glittering celebration instantly became a crime scene, and Margaret transformed from an unnoticed catering assistant into both the prime suspect and the woman who had unknowingly saved the life of the most powerful man in the city, long before anyone was willing to believe her. 15 minutes after the poisoned flute was discovered, the luxurious ballroom transformed into a sealed crime scene. The string quartet fell silent. Crystal glasses remained untouched. Hundreds of influential guests stood frozen as armed security officers quietly locked every exit. No one was allowed to leave. Nathaniel Kane sat exactly where he had been moments earlier, his calm expression revealing almost nothing. Yet every member of his security detail understood the truth. Someone had attempted to assassinate the most feared financier in the city while surrounded by senators, industrialists, and foreign consuls. That alone was enough to terrify everyone inside the hotel. But one question frightened them even more. Who had switched the glass? Within minutes, surveillance footage replayed across dozens of monitors. Every camera captured the same moment. A plus-size woman in a catering uniform, carrying a silver tray, walking toward Nathaniel's table. She reached out, removed one flute, replaced it with another, then calmly walked away.
No panique, no hesitation, no explanation.
Head of Security Owen Marsh watched the recording 3 times before turning to his men. Bring her in. Margaret Doyle had expected to finish her shift before midnight. Instead, she found herself sitting inside a private security office beneath the hotel. The room was cold, windowless, almost designed to make innocent people feel guilty. 2 armed guards stood near the door while another officer reviewed surveillance footage again and again. Nobody offered her water. Nobody smiled. Nobody thanked her. One investigator finally placed both hands on the table. Why did you switch Mr. Kane's champagne? Margaret lowered her eyes for a brief moment. I thought something was wrong. What exactly? I don't know. The investigator frowned. You don't know? She slowly shook her head. I only noticed something that didn't feel right. The answer immediately frustrated everyone in the room. One officer leaned forward. Someone almost murdered the most powerful man in this city. I know. And your explanation is that something felt wrong? She nodded quietly. Yes. Silence filled the room. The explanation sounded ridiculous. Even Margaret knew that. If someone else had told her the same story, she probably wouldn't have believed it either. For nearly an hour, the questions repeated. Did anyone approach her before the gala? Was she working with a rival organization? Did someone pay her? Had she touched the poisoned glass beforehand? Every answer remained the same. No, no, no. And finally, I don't know. By the end of the interrogation, the investigators looked more confused than when they had started. She didn't behave like a criminal. She wasn't defensive. She never contradicted herself. Yet she couldn't explain the one thing that mattered most. How had she known? Outside the security office, rumors spread much faster than facts. Guests whispered inside waiting lounges. Hotel employees gathered in small groups. Security personnel quietly exchanged theories. Some believed Margaret had saved Nathaniel's life. Others believed she had staged everything herself. The wildest rumor claimed she had poisoned the glass before pretending to rescue him. Absurd stories multiplied every minute. People always preferred dramatic explanations over complicated truths. Unfortunately, Margaret was the easiest person to blame. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't powerful. She had no influential family. She was simply another catering worker, ordinary, disposable. Shortly after midnight, security released her. Not because they trusted her, but because they had found absolutely nothing connecting her to the assassination attempt. Still, freedom offered little comfort. When Margaret returned to work the following morning, conversations immediately stopped. Several co-workers watched her enter through the staff door. One server folded her arms. So the famous hero finally showed up. A few people laughed. Another employee shook his head. I still think something doesn't add up. Someone whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. Normal catering staff don't notice poison before professional security does. More laughter followed. Margaret quietly changed into her uniform. She said nothing. She had spent most of her life learning that defending herself rarely changed anyone's opinion. People usually believed whatever fit their expectations, and nobody expected someone who looked like her to be the smartest person in the room. That afternoon, the hotel hosted a press briefing to reassure investors and guests. Journalists filled the conference hall. Television cameras pointed toward the speakers. Among the invited guests stood Camille Rousseau, one of the country's most influential socialites and a major donor to the charity foundation that had organized the gala. Elegant, confident, accustomed to admiration. Before long, a reporter raised the topic everyone wanted to discuss. The woman who switched the champagne. Several cameras immediately turned. Camille smiled gracefully. A fascinating story. The reporter nodded. Do you believe she saved Mr. Kane's life? Camille's smile never changed. I believe she happened to be standing in the right place. A few guests chuckled. She continued calmly. People are calling her courageous. A brief pause. I think fortunate is a far better description. More polite laughter echoed through the room. Near the back of the hall, Margaret quietly lowered her head. She hadn't intended to attend the briefing. Hotel management had required several staff members to remain nearby in case additional questions arose. Now she wished she'd stayed hidden. Camille wasn't finished. Society loves turning ordinary accidents into heroic legends. The cameras continued recording. Perhaps next week we'll discover she was simply lucky after all. More laughter followed. Margaret clenched her hands behind her back. Not because the words were cruel, but because they sounded believable. Maybe she had been lucky. Maybe everyone else was right. Maybe there really was nothing special about what she had done. Across the room, another person heard every sentence. Nathaniel Kane. He had entered quietly through a private entrance without attracting attention. He watched Camille. Then he looked toward Margaret. What caught his attention wasn't the humiliation. It was Margaret's reaction. She never interrupted, never argued, never demanded recognition. She simply endured the insults in silence. That silence unsettled Nathaniel far more than any speech could have. For the first time since the assassination attempt, he stopped thinking about the poison glass. Instead, he found himself wondering about the quiet woman everyone seemed so eager to underestimate. And without realizing it, his curiosity had just become something much more personal. Nathaniel Kane rarely became curious about people. Power had taught him a simple lesson long ago. Most people approached him because they wanted something. Money, protection, influence, a favor that only the city's most powerful financier could grant. Margaret Doyle was different. She had walked away after switching his glass. She never asked whether he was safe, never demanded gratitude, never contacted his office, never spoke to the press. For someone who had suddenly become the center of national attention, she seemed determined to disappear. That alone made Nathaniel suspicious. 3 days after the gala, a thick folder landed on his desk. Only one name appeared on the cover: Margaret Doyle. His chief investigator waited silently while Nathaniel opened the file. Inside were employment records, academic transcripts, medical bills, financial statements. Everything looked painfully ordinary. 31 years old, catering assistant, no criminal history, no unusual bank transfers, no hidden connections. Nothing suggested she had planned an assassination or prevented one. Nathaniel closed the folder. That's everything? The investigator hesitated. Not quite. He slid another document across the desk. A university transcript. Nathaniel glanced down. His eyes narrowed. Pharmacology. Highest honors first 2 years. Laboratory research awards. Outstanding analytical skills. He looked back at the investigator. She studied pharmacology until she left school. Why? The investigator answered quietly. Her mother became ill unexpectedly. Another page appeared. Medical expenses, hospital invoices, prescription costs. Her mother's name appeared again and again. She left university to support her family. Nathaniel remained silent. The investigator continued. Since then, she's worked restaurants, catering companies, private events, wherever she could earn enough to pay the bills. The room grew quiet. Nothing about the report matched the image people had created. The media described her as a lucky server. The facts described someone who had sacrificed her future without complaining. Yet one mystery remained. How had she recognized the danger? Later that afternoon, Nathaniel requested one more investigation. Forget the gala. The investigator looked surprised. Then what should we focus on? Her mother's caretaker. Within 24 hours, another report arrived. Walter Doyle, Margaret's late uncle, a compounding pharmacist. Nearly 28 years dispensing medication, testing formulations, and overseeing a small independent pharmacy. His career revolved around one responsibility: catch a dangerous interaction before it reached a patient. Former colleagues described him with remarkable consistency. Patient, meticulous, obsessed with details. One retired pharmacist laughed during the interview. Walter couldn't fill a prescription without double-checking the color of the powder. Another remembered something else. He treated every strange smell in the back room as a warning. Nathaniel slowly continued reading. At home, Walter had shared everything he learned with his niece. How to recognize an unusual sheen. How tiny particulates could reveal contamination. How subtle color shifts often meant a chemical reaction had occurred. Most kids ignored those lessons. Margaret hadn't. She loved learning beside her uncle. When Nathaniel reached the final page, the answer finally began to appear. She hadn't acted because of luck. She had acted because years of quiet observation had become instinct. The poison flute hadn't looked normal. The carbonation was wrong. The faint bitter almond smell was wrong. The nervous waiter who'd adjusted the tray was wrong. Individually, each clue meant very little. Together, they whispered danger, exactly as her uncle had taught her. 2 days later, Nathaniel visited one of his foundation's community health clinics without informing anyone. Officially, he was there to inspect the program. Unofficially, he wanted to see Margaret without cameras, without investigators, and without public attention. The building buzzed with volunteers. Families waited for free checkups. Children laughed while elderly residents sat patiently in line. Nathaniel spotted Margaret almost immediately. She wasn't speaking to reporters. She wasn't telling anyone she had saved his life. She wore simple volunteer clothes and spent the afternoon sorting donated medication, organizing supply boxes, and helping elderly visitors read their prescription labels. No photographers surrounded her. No applause followed her. She behaved exactly the same as everyone else. For nearly an hour, Nathaniel watched from a distance. An elderly man accidentally knocked over a box of supplies. Bandages and bottles scattered across the floor. Before anyone else reacted, Margaret hurried over. "It's all right," she said with a gentle smile. "We'll pick them up together." She knelt on the tile without hesitation. The old man apologized repeatedly. Margaret only laughed. "You don't have to apologize for being human." The words were simple, but Nathaniel noticed something. There was no performance, no audience, no reward waiting for her. Kindness came naturally to her. That impressed him more than anything written in the investigation file. As Margaret finished restocking the last box, she turned and froze. Nathaniel Kane stood only a few feet away. The surrounding volunteers immediately became nervous. Whispers spread across the clinic floor. Margaret walked toward him carefully. "Mr. Kane." He nodded once. "Miss Doyle." Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, Nathaniel broke the silence. "I've been trying to understand something." She smiled awkwardly. "So has everyone else." He reached into his jacket and placed a thin folder on a nearby table. "My investigators discovered what your uncle used to do." Margaret's smile slowly faded. She looked down at the folder but didn't open it. Instead, her eyes drifted somewhere far away. "He loved teaching," she said quietly. Nathaniel waited. "When I was little, he made everything into a lesson." A faint smile appeared. If a syrup looked cloudy, he noticed. If a pill batch smelled off, he noticed. If a label didn't match the color inside the bottle, he noticed. She looked toward the floor. "He always said, danger almost never announces itself." A brief pause. "It whispers." Nathaniel remembered the surveillance footage. The strange carbonation, the faint bitter smell, the nervous waiter. Everything suddenly fit together. "So that night," Margaret nodded before he finished. "I didn't know someone was trying to kill you." She took a slow breath. "I only knew the glass didn't belong there." Her voice grew softer. "My uncle taught me to trust small details." Another quiet moment settled between them. For weeks the world had called her lucky. Standing only a few feet away, Nathaniel finally understood the truth. Luck had nothing to do with it. Margaret Doyle had saved his life because she noticed what everyone else had ignored. And as he watched her gently return to helping strangers without expecting recognition, Nathaniel realized something even more remarkable. The woman everyone dismissed as ordinary possessed a quiet strength that could never be measured by wealth, status, or appearance. Unfortunately, while Nathaniel had finally discovered the truth, someone else had already decided that Margaret Doyle's growing reputation needed to be destroyed before the entire city started believing it. The story refused to disappear. Every news channel replayed the footage of Margaret Doyle switching the champagne flutes. Some commentators praised her. Others insisted she had simply been lucky. The debate spread across television, newspapers, podcasts, and social media until nearly everyone in the city had formed an opinion about a woman they had never met. Margaret tried to ignore it. She muted notifications, avoided interviews, rejected every television invitation. When reporters waited outside the hotel after her shifts, she quietly left through the staff entrance. She wanted one thing, her ordinary life back. Unfortunately, someone else had very different plans. Camille Rousseau watched the headlines with growing frustration. For years, she had been one of the country's most admired socialites. Every charity gala revolved around her. Every interview praised her generosity. Now reporters only wanted to discuss one person, a catering worker. Each headline mentioning Margaret felt like another piece of Camille's influence slipping away. She refused to accept it. When the annual Harbor City Legacy Summit announced that several community volunteers, including Margaret, would be honored for their service, Camille saw an opportunity, not to congratulate her, but to destroy her credibility once and for all. Margaret almost declined the invitation. The elegant ballroom reminded her too much of the night that changed her life. Crystal chandeliers, luxury gowns, powerful people. Places where she always felt invisible. The director of the community clinic smiled gently. You've earned this. Margaret wasn't convinced. Still, she attended. She wore the nicest dress she owned. Simple, modest, nothing expensive, nothing designed to attract attention. She hoped no one would notice her. She underestimated how famous she had become. Several guests whispered as she entered. A few smiled kindly. Others stared with open curiosity. Some quietly judged. She recognized the expressions immediately. People weren't seeing Margaret Doyle. They were seeing the woman from the headlines. For the first hour, everything remained peaceful. She spoke with volunteers, thanked donors, helped organize seating for elderly guests. Little by little, she relaxed. Then Camille arrived. The room shifted almost instantly. Camera flashes followed her through the ballroom. Executives hurried over. Officials greeted her warmly. She accepted every compliment with effortless confidence. Then she noticed Margaret. Their eyes met for only a second. Camille smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. Later that evening, guests gathered for a networking reception. Small conversations filled the ballroom. Soft music played in the background. Camille walked directly toward the group where Margaret stood speaking with two elderly volunteers. Without asking permission, she stepped into the circle. Ladies and gentlemen, her voice carried just loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. I believe we're standing beside tonight's celebrity. Several people turned. More eyes followed. Within seconds, dozens of conversations had stopped. Margaret immediately recognized what was happening. Camille lifted her champagne glass. The famous server. A few guests laughed politely. She continued, I suppose saving powerful men has become an excellent career opportunity. More laughter, some uncomfortable, some genuine. The elderly volunteer beside Margaret frowned. That's unfair. Camille smiled without looking at her. I'm only stating facts. She turned toward Margaret. Tell me. Her voice dripped with false kindness. How does it feel, becoming important because of someone else's life? Silence spread across the ballroom. Every camera pointed toward them. Every guest waited. Margaret felt her heartbeat pounding inside her chest. Years of cruel comments rushed back all at once. Too overweight. Too ordinary. Too forgettable. Not smart enough. Not worthy of respect. She lowered her eyes. She had no interest in arguing. Camille mistook that silence for weakness. She stepped closer. I imagine luck like yours doesn't happen twice. A few people looked away. Others exchanged uncomfortable glances. Still, nobody intervened. At the opposite end of the ballroom, Nathaniel Kane had just entered through a private entrance. His security team quietly followed behind him. Before anyone could greet him, he noticed something unusual. The crowd had gathered in one corner. Nobody was smiling anymore. He saw Camille. Then he saw Margaret. He watched for only a few seconds. It was enough. Nathaniel walked forward. The crowd instinctively parted. Conversation stopped. No one needed an announcement. Power had entered the room. Camille recovered first. She offered a polished smile. Mr. Kane. Nathaniel didn't return it. His attention remained on Margaret. She stood silently, refusing to defend herself. Exactly as she had during the press conference. Exactly as she had during the interrogation. Always choosing silence over conflict. Nathaniel finally spoke. You seem very interested in judging people tonight. His voice remained calm. That somehow made it even more intimidating. Camille forced a laugh. We're simply having a conversation.
No, Nathaniel answered quietly.
You were humiliating her. The words echoed through the ballroom. Nobody moved. Nobody dared interrupt. Camille tried again. I think society exaggerates what happened. Nathaniel slowly stepped beside Margaret. Not in front of her, not behind her, beside her. The gesture alone changed everything. Every guest understood its meaning. Camille's smile began to fade. You cannot seriously believe she deserves all this attention. Nathaniel looked directly into her eyes. No. A long silence followed. I believe she deserves far more respect than she has ever received. The ballroom became completely still. Nathaniel continued. You call her lucky. A pause. I call her observant. Another pause. You call her ordinary? He glanced briefly toward Margaret. I call her extraordinary. Several reporters immediately began recording. No one wanted to miss a single word. Nathaniel looked across the crowd. Every trained security officer in that ballroom missed the warning signs. Another pause. She didn't. He allowed the sentence to settle. She acted while everyone else remained comfortable doing nothing. The silence became overwhelming. Camille searched for a response. None came, because every argument she had prepared suddenly sounded insignificant. Nathaniel's final sentence left no room for debate. No one who remained seated while danger approached has earned the right to look down on the woman who stood up and stopped it. The room erupted into whispers. Some guests nodded. Others lowered their eyes in embarrassment. The volunteers beside Margaret smiled proudly. For the first time since the gala, people weren't looking at her with suspicion. They were looking at her with respect. Margaret felt tears forming. Not because Nathaniel had defended her. Because someone had finally spoken the truth she never found the courage to say herself. She turned toward him. Thank you. Nathaniel offered only the slightest smile. You don't have to thank me. His voice remained low enough that only she could hear. I simply refused to let another lie become louder than the truth. Neither of them noticed dozens of cameras capturing the moment. By sunrise, every major news network in the country would be replaying those few unforgettable minutes. The public conversation was about to change forever. And for the first time since that poisoned flute was quietly exchanged, the city would finally begin asking not whether Margaret Doyle had been lucky, but how they had all managed to overlook someone extraordinary standing in front of them all along. The official report was released exactly 9 days after Nathaniel Kane defended Margaret Doyle before the city's elite. Unlike the endless rumors that had dominated television for weeks, the document contained only facts. Every frame of surveillance footage had been analyzed. Every witness had been questioned. Every trace of the compound had been examined by independent forensic laboratories. The conclusion left no room for debate. The poison had been nearly impossible to detect. It produced no obvious discoloration, no visible residue, no taste an ordinary person could recognize. Only an almost invisible shift in the champagne's carbonation and a faint bitter almond odor distinguished it from an untouched glass. The report ended with a single sentence that every newspaper printed on its front page. Without the intervention of Miss Margaret Doyle, Mr. Nathaniel Kane would have consumed the contaminated champagne. For the first time since the gala, silence replaced speculation. Television hosts who had mocked her apologized on live broadcasts. Security experts admitted they had missed the warning signs. Journalists rewrote their stories. But none of those changes mattered as much as what happened inside the hotel where Margaret still worked. When she walked through the staff entrance the following morning, nobody laughed. Nobody whispered. The same co-workers who had avoided standing beside her now quietly stepped aside to let her pass. One by one they approached her. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have judged you. I believed the rumors. Margaret answered every apology the same way. I hope we all learned something. There was no bitterness in her voice, no satisfaction. She had never wanted revenge. She had only wanted the truth. That quiet grace spread through the hotel faster than any headline ever had. Not everyone escaped the consequences. Camille Rousseau watched her carefully crafted reputation collapse, piece by piece. Sponsors withdrew. Board memberships quietly disappeared. Several charitable organizations announced new leadership. The public wasn't condemning her because she had made a mistake. They condemned her because even after seeing kindness, intelligence, and courage, she had chosen humiliation. For the first time in decades, influence could not protect her from accountability. Margaret never commented. When reporters waited outside the hotel asking whether she felt vindicated, she simply smiled. "I hope Ms. Rousseau finds peace." The interview lasted less than 30 seconds. Yet those 6 words spread across the internet within hours. People expected triumph. Instead, they witnessed compassion. Even Nathaniel watched the interview twice. Then he quietly closed his laptop. "You really are different," he murmured. A week later, Margaret received an invitation to Kane Hall. She almost declined. She had visited grand buildings only as an employee, never as a guest. When she arrived, Nathaniel greeted her himself. No security escort, no formal ceremony. Just the two of them walking through the gardens overlooking the river. For several minutes, neither spoke. Finally, Nathaniel broke the silence. "I owe you more than my life." Margaret shook her head. "You don't owe me anything." "I do. You never asked for recognition. You never asked for money. You never even asked whether I was grateful." She smiled softly. "I didn't save you because you were Nathaniel Kane." She looked toward the trees. "I saved you because someone was in danger." Those simple words stopped him in his tracks. Throughout his life, nearly every act of kindness shown toward him had carried a price. Loyalty bought with money, respect built on fear, friendship measured by influence. Yet standing beside him was a woman who had expected absolutely nothing in return. For the first time in years, Nathaniel felt something unfamiliar. "Peace." He reached into his jacket and handed her a folder. "This isn't payment." Margaret looked down. Inside was a proposal. The Kane Foundation planned to launch a nationwide medication safety and public health education initiative in memory of Walter Doyle, her uncle's name. She froze. I don't understand." Nathaniel smiled. "I spent weeks reading about your uncle. He spent his life teaching people how to notice small dangers before they became tragedies." He looked directly into her eyes. "I think that legacy deserves to continue." Tears slowly filled Margaret's eyes. Nobody outside her family had spoken her uncle's name in years. Now the city's most powerful man wanted to build something in his honor. She closed the folder carefully. "I don't know if I'm capable of leading something this important." Nathaniel answered without hesitation. "I've trusted men with fleets. I've trusted lawyers with billion-dollar contracts. I've trusted officials with my future." A faint smile appeared, "And somehow trusting you feels easier than trusting any of them." For the first time since they met, Margaret laughed. A genuine laugh. Warm, unforced. It echoed through the quiet garden. 6 months later, the Kane Foundation's annual gala returned to the very ballroom where everything had begun. The same chandeliers illuminated the marble floor. The same quartet played softly beneath the towering ceiling. Yet the atmosphere felt entirely different. Months earlier, Margaret had entered carrying a silver tray. Tonight, she entered through the front doors beside the Foundation's executive board. Community leaders greeted her by name. University researchers thanked her for supporting new pharmacology scholarships. Parents embraced her because the Foundation's medical assistance program had saved their families from impossible debt. Walter Doyle's initiative had already trained thousands of healthcare workers across the country. His lessons were now protecting lives far beyond anything he could have imagined. As the evening drew to a close, Nathaniel stepped onto the stage. The ballroom fell silent. "I've attended hundreds of events in this room," he began. "I've signed contracts worth billions of dollars. I've made decisions that changed industries. He paused. But none of those moments changed me as much as one woman exchanging 2 champagne glasses. Every eye turned toward Margaret. I spent most of my life believing strength meant control. He looked at her. Margaret Doyle taught me that real strength begins with paying attention to people everyone else ignores. His voice softened. She didn't save me because I deserved saving. She saved me because compassion was already part of who she was. Another long silence settled across the ballroom. I can replace money. I can rebuild businesses. I can recover from betrayal. But there is one thing power cannot buy. He smiled. A good heart. Nathaniel stepped down from the stage and walked toward Margaret. This time the cameras didn't matter. Neither did the guests. He stopped only an arm's length away. Months ago, he said, quietly enough that only those nearest could hear, "I thought you had saved my life." A gentle smile crossed Margaret's face. "I did." He shook his head. "No, you saved something much harder." She looked at him with quiet confusion. "My faith that goodness still exists." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Nathaniel extended his hand. Not as a financier, not as one of the most powerful men in the country, simply as a man asking another person to walk beside him. "Margaret Doyle." His voice carried clearly through the silent ballroom. "Will you help me build a future where fewer people are overlooked the way you once were?" She looked around the room. 6 months earlier, many of those same faces had doubted her. Now every one of them waited, not with judgment, but with hope. She placed her hand in his. "I'd be honored." The ballroom erupted into applause. Hundreds of people rose to their feet. Some cheered, others wiped away tears. As the applause echoed beneath the crystal chandeliers, Margaret glanced toward the place where she had once stood, silently holding a silver tray, praying no one would notice her. She smiled, not because her life had become extraordinary, but because she had finally learned that her worth had never depended on whether the world chose to see it. On the night she exchanged 2 champagne glasses, everyone believed she had saved the city's most feared financier. In truth, she had done something far rarer. She had reminded one of the most powerful men in America, and everyone watching, that greatness is often hidden inside the people the world overlooks.